Somewhere in France right now, in a drawer that hasn't been opened in years, there is almost certainly a piece of paper like this one. It is large and ornate and beautiful. Printed in two languages, French on one side, Russian on the other. Across the top, the double-headed eagle of the Romanov dynasty. Down the margins, elegant scrollwork and a promise, set in gold ink, to pay the bearer a fixed sum of interest, twice a year, forever. For more than 30 years, paper exactly like this was sold to ordinary French citizens as the single safest thing they could possibly do with their money. It was the sovereign debt of a great empire. It was backed, they were told, by gold. It carried the quiet blessing of the French state itself. A widow bought it for her security. A shopkeeper bought it for his retirement. A farmer in the provinces bought it because the newspaper he trusted told him it was the patriotic and the prudent thing to do. And then, in the opening weeks of 1918, in the space of a few printed lines, the new rulers of Russia declared every single one of those certificates void. Not devalued, not suspended, not delayed until better times. Void. Worthless. As if the debt had never existed at all. In one decree, the savings of more than 1 million French families were erased, and not one of them would ever see a single franc of it back. This was not an act of God. It was not a market crash, or a run on a bank, or a war that swallowed the money. It was a decision. A deliberate, calculated decision by a government that had concluded it no longer cared in the slightest what the financial markets of the world thought of it. And to this day, it remains the largest and the most completely successful act of debt repudiation in the history of the modern world. Now, every other story we tell on this channel is, at its heart, a story about the power of the creditor. The bank that breaks the borrower. The bondholder who owns the future. The lender whose ledgers can bring an empire to its knees without firing a shot. This is the one story where that entire logic shattered. Where the whip broke in the lender's hand, and the most powerful financial markets on earth discovered they were holding nothing at all. Because here is the truth that the entire architecture of global finance is built to never say out loud. The most devastating financial weapon of the 20th century was not a clever instrument dreamed up in the City of London. It was not a currency raid, or a bond market siege, or a coordinated assault on an exchange rate. It was the simplest weapon imaginable. The flat refusal to pay, wielded by a state that had stopped pretending the rules applied to it. And it raises a question this whole story exists to answer. How did the most trusted investment on the Paris Exchange, the gold standard of middle-class respectability, become almost overnight the textbook definition of ruin? And the harder question beneath it, why did the people who held this paper trust it so completely, so absolutely, right up to the very end, when the warnings had been flashing for more than a decade? The answer to that second question is, in some ways, the more uncomfortable one. Because that trust did not simply happen. It was built. It was manufactured, deliberately, by people who knew exactly what they were doing. And before we go any further, let me be very clear about something, because the moment you say the words, "the bankers misled them," somebody reaches for the phrase, conspiracy theory. This is not that. This is settled, documented, mainstream economic history. It is laid out in detail by serious scholars, among them the historian Hassan Malik, whose 2018 book, Bankers and Bolsheviks, traces precisely how this catastrophe was assembled. And the most damning evidence comes not from speculation, but from the private correspondence of the very men who sold these bonds. Letters that the Soviet government itself dug up and published in 1931, specifically to embarrass Paris with the truth of how the whole thing had worked. We are not guessing at the machinery here. We have the receipts. If you want the stories that actually explain why your money behaves the way it does, the hidden mechanics underneath the headlines, this is the channel built to give them to you. So consider subscribing, and then let's begin. Because to understand how 1 million French households ended up holding paper backed by a corpse of an empire, we have to go back. Not to the revolution, but to a marriage of money and fear that was sealed an entire generation before the first Bolshevik ever came to power. In the last decade of the 19th century, two nations that had almost nothing in common discovered that they needed each other with a desperation neither would fully admit. And the thing that bound them together was not affection. It was fear. And it was money in roughly equal measure. On one side stood France, rich and cautious and slightly stagnant, a country with more savings than it knew what to do with, generating a constant surplus of capital that sat looking for somewhere safe to earn a return. The French had turned thrift into something close to a national religion. A vast class of small savers, the rentiers, lived not by working, but by clipping the coupons off their bonds twice a year and living on the interest. And what they craved above all else was not a spectacular return, but a safe and certain one. A payment that would arrive without fail, year after year, for the rest of their lives and their children's lives after them. They were the most risk-averse investors on earth, and there were millions of them. But France in the 1890s was also a nation living under a shadow. 2 decades earlier, in 1870, it had been humiliated by Germany in a matter of weeks, its army shattered, its emperor captured, the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine torn away. And ever since, one thought had haunted every French strategist who lay awake at night: the terror of one day facing a rising, militarized Germany completely alone. On the other side stood Russia, vast, almost beyond comprehension, ambitious, and chronically, structurally starved of cash. It was an empire ruled by an autocrat, an empire that desperately wanted to drag itself into the industrial age, to build the factories and the steel mills, and above all, the railways that a modern great power required. But it simply could not raise that kind of capital from its own backward, peasant economy. It needed someone else's money, a great deal of someone else's money. You can see the shape of the bargain already. France had savings and needed a friend against Germany. Russia had manpower and needed capital. And so, in the early 1890s, the two of them, the Republic and the autocracy, about as ideologically opposite as two governments could be, signed the Franco-Russian alliance. On paper, it was a military pact, but the real mortar holding it together was financial. France would lend, Russia would arm, and both of them, with the Tsar's millions of soldiers on one flank and France's industry on the other, would face Germany together. The man who turned that bargain into a machine was Russia's finance minister, Sergei Witte, one of the most consequential figures in this entire story, and a name worth remembering. Witte's vision was audacious. He would industrialize Russia not on Russian money, which barely existed, but on borrowed Western money, which he intended to import on a colossal scale. He would build railways across the empire, most famously the Great Trans-Siberian Line, laid down with foreign capital. And in 1897, in his single most important move, Witte put the Russian ruble onto the gold standard. That technical-sounding decision was the masterstroke. By tying the ruble to gold, Witte made Russian government debt look, on paper, as solid and as safe as the debt of any nation in Europe. He was deliberately dressing the bonds of an autocracy in the respectable clothing of sound money. And here's the detail that makes this so much darker than a simple investment story. A great deal of that French money did not go into factories that made things people wanted. It went into railways. And many of those railways had a purpose that had nothing to do with commerce. They were strategic lines, laid out by Russian generals, designed to do one thing: move millions of Russian soldiers to the German frontier as fast as humanly possible the next time war came. So the cautious French saver, depositing his money in what he believed was the safest asset in Europe, was in reality helping to finance the encirclement of Germany, building the very tracks down which a future catastrophe would one day roll. He had no idea. That was rather the point. By the time all of this had run its course, the numbers were staggering. By most estimates, French investors had poured more than 10 billion gold francs into Russian securities, which amounted to something like a quarter of everything France had invested anywhere beyond its own borders. No other foreign country came close. Russia was, by a wide margin, the single largest destination of French money in the world. But an autocracy is a difficult thing to sell to a cautious public. To persuade a French shopkeeper to hand his life savings to a distant Tsar he would never meet, in a country he would never see, it was not enough for the bonds to be profitable. They had to look safe. They had to feel safe. And that required a machine of its own. Not a machine of production, but a machine of persuasion. So consider the problem from the inside. How exactly do you persuade a schoolteacher in Bordeaux, a careful woman who has never left France and never will, that the Tsar of all the Russias is a more reliable debtor than the man who runs the shop across her own street? How do you make a faraway empire feel like a sure thing? Part of the answer was respectability, and respectability the French establishment supplied in abundance. The Russian bonds were not sold in some back alley. They were floated through France's most prestigious banks, the institutions whose names alone conferred trust. They carried the implicit endorsement of the French government, which wanted Russia solvent and armed, and had every diplomatic reason to see the bond succeed. To the ordinary buyer, everything about the transaction radiated solidity and discretion and safety. But that respectability was not entirely real. A great deal of it was engineered, and we know precisely how, because of a man named Arthur Rafalovich. Rafalovich was the Russian finance ministry's agent in Paris, its fixer, its man on the ground in the French capital. And among his responsibilities was the management of what amounted to a slush fund, a steady stream of secret payments whose purpose was to buy the goodwill of the French press. Money flowed to newspapers in exchange for favorable coverage of Russian bonds, glowing articles, reassuring assessments, and crucially, silence. Silence about anything that might frighten an investor. In his own correspondence, the letters the Soviets would later publish in 1931 to humiliate the French establishment, Rafalovich described the operation with a phrase so blunt it became infamous. He called it, simply, the abominable venality of the French press. The men running the scheme were under no illusions about what they were doing. They knew exactly how the confidence was being manufactured, and they wrote it down. And the effect of that machine was not just to add a layer of positive spin. Its more important function was to suppress the truth, because there was plenty of truth that a French saver might have wanted to know. Russia was politically unstable. It was deeply repressive. Beneath its gold-plated financial surface, the empire was rigid, brittle, and far more fragile than the Paris newspapers ever let on. But the warning signs were softened, or buried, or simply never printed at all, in the respectable papers that ordinary investors actually read and actually believed. And so it worked, spectacularly. The Russian bond, the Rente Russe, did not remain some exotic speculation for the adventurous. It became woven into the very fabric of French middle-class life. It was the default safe asset. It was what a sensible person owned. It was recommended by the press, sold by the banks, and blessed by the state. A respectable, patriotic, gilt-edged cornerstone of a careful family's future. Across the entire country, in modest homes by the hundreds of thousands, it sat in the drawer as the thing you did not have to worry about. And for years, the illusion held perfectly. The interest arrived twice a year, exactly as promised. The machine hummed. And then, in 1904, reality fired its first warning shot. And it came, of all places, from the far side of the world. The empire that had been sold to French savers as a rising colossus, the unstoppable power of the future, was about to be humiliated. And humiliated by a nation that most French investors could not have found on a map. In 1904, war broke out between Russia and Japan, and it went catastrophically for Russia. The supposed giant was beaten on land and, even more shockingly, at sea. In one of the most extraordinary episodes of the age, the Russian Baltic fleet was ordered to sail almost the entire way around the planet, some 18,000 miles from the Baltic to the Pacific, only to be annihilated almost in its entirety in a single afternoon at the Battle of Tsushima. The myth of Russian invincibility did not just crack, it was vaporized. And defeat abroad lit a fire at home. It began in January of 1905, on a day that came to be remembered as Bloody Sunday, when troops outside the Winter Palace opened fire on a crowd of unarmed workers who had marched, peacefully and even reverently, to beg the Tsar himself for relief. The shock of that massacre detonated the country. In 1905, revolution swept across the Russian Empire. Mass strikes, mutiny in the armed forces, the autocracy shaking to its foundations as it had never shaken before. The regime survived, barely, but the cost was enormous, and Russia found itself teetering on the very edge of bankruptcy. This was the moment. This was precisely when a rational market should have turned and run for the exits, when the careful French saver, seeing his safe empire defeated in war and convulsed by revolution and nearly broke, should have been warned, loudly and clearly, to get his money out. Instead, the opposite happened. In 1906, Russia floated what was at that time the largest foreign loan the world had ever seen, the biggest single sovereign borrowing on record up to that point, and it was subscribed overwhelmingly in France. Let that settle for a moment. At the exact instant the Russian autocracy was at its weakest and most desperate, the savings of ordinary French families rode to its rescue. With the quiet encouragement of a French government that needed its ally to stay solvent and stay armed against Germany, the money poured in and bailed the Tsar out. And what did the Tsar do with this enormous infusion of French cash? Having secured the money, and with it a measure of financial independence from his own people, he turned around within months and dissolved the elected Duma, Russia's brand new, fragile parliament, and set about crushing the very movement for reform that the West had imagined it was encouraging. French savings had not bought reform. They had bought the regime the breathing room to strangle it. The warning could not possibly have been clearer. This was an unstable, repressive, militarily defeated regime that had nearly collapsed and could not pay its own way without reaching into the pockets of French households. Everything a prudent investor needed to know was now visible, in plain sight. And yet the money kept flowing. Right up to a bright summer morning in 1914, when the whole elaborate arrangement walked, with its eyes open, straight into the fire it had spent 2 decades helping to build. In the summer of 1914, the alliance that French savings had financed did exactly the thing it had been designed to do. The strategic railways carried the troops. The mobilization plans unfolded. The great war that everyone had prepared for, and no one had truly believed in, arrived. And it began, almost immediately, to destroy the borrower. Russia's need for money now exploded beyond anything in its history. The sums it had borrowed before the war, vast as they were dwarfed by the cost of fighting it. Russia borrowed on a colossal new scale, now from Britain as well as France, and shipped its gold abroad to keep the lines of credit open and the munitions flowing. Trainloads of Russian gold rolled west to Britain as collateral against the loans, and yet, even so, the men at the front were so starved of supplies that by 1915, some Russian infantry were being sent into battle without rifles at all, told to arm themselves from the bodies of the fallen. The money was flowing out, and it was not even buying victory. And the war bled the empire white. Casualties ran into the millions. The economy, never strong, began to buckle and then to break under a strain no one had imagined when they bought their safe sovereign paper. The whole bet had rested on Russia being a stable, enduring great power. The war was proving, month by terrible month, that it was nothing of the kind. And then, in March of 1917, the unthinkable happened. And yet for the bondholders, it arrived disguised as relief. The Tsar fell. The 300-year-old Romanov dynasty simply collapsed under the weight of the war, swept away in the February Revolution. And for the creditors of Paris and London, this was, at first, almost reassuring news, because the new provisional government that took power moved immediately to calm exactly the right nerves. It pledged, formally and publicly, to honor every last one of Russia's debts and to remain in the war alongside its allies. The message to the markets was precise and deliberate. Nothing has changed for you. Only the management has changed. The bonds are safe. And so, for a few months in 1917, Paris exhaled. The dynasty was gone, but the debt, the sacred, gilt-edged debt, would be honored, as debts had always been honored, by whoever happened to be running Russia. But the provisional government was standing on ground that was already crumbling beneath its feet. And the men waiting in the wings, the men who would soon push it aside, held a theory about what a debt was actually worth that was unlike anything the lenders of the world had ever had to face. To understand what happened next, you have to understand the one assumption the creditors were making. The assumption that felt so obvious it barely needed stating, because every regime in living memory had confirmed it. The assumption was this: whoever ended up ruling Russia, whatever flag they flew and whatever speeches they made, would eventually need access to the world's capital. They would need to borrow again, to trade, to rebuild. And no government could do any of that if it had repudiated its debts. Because a state that simply refuses to pay gets locked out of the financial system entirely, shunned by every lender on earth. The cost of walking away was so catastrophic that no serious power could possibly choose it. Therefore, the new rulers, however radical, would have to honor the old bonds. They would have no choice. The logic was airtight. It had never failed. The Bolsheviks did not share the assumption. In October of 1917, Lenin's party seized power, and they looked at the mountain of debt the Tsar and the provisional government had run up, and they came to a conclusion the markets had never seriously contemplated. To them, these were not Russia's debts at all. These were the debts of the Tsar, the debts of the exploiting classes, contracted to oppress the Russian people and to wage an imperialist war for the benefit of capitalists. The Russian people, in this view, had never agreed to a single franc of it, and so the Russian people owed nothing, not less, nothing. And in the opening weeks of 1918, the new government acted on that conviction. It issued the decree on the annulment of state loans, and in a few short lines, it canceled the entire debt. Every foreign and domestic loan contracted by the Tsarist and the provisional governments wiped out unconditionally, without exception. The foreign holders were not an afterthought. They were named explicitly. The single largest pool of foreign creditors in that decree was the people of France. And then the new regime compounded the wound twice over. In March, at the town of Brest-Litovsk, it signed a separate peace with Germany and walked straight out of the war, abandoning the very allies whose citizens' savings had financed the entire alliance. And within those same weeks, Lenin's government picked up the seat of Russian power and moved it from Petrograd to the ancient fortress at the heart of the country, the Kremlin in Moscow. The city whose name would, from that day forward and forever after, be attached to the decree that erased a fortune. And here, in the cold light of early 1918, the financial markets of the world discovered the flaw that lies at the very heart of all sovereign lending. A flaw that the gold standard and the respectable banks and the elegant certificates had concealed for decades. There was no recourse. None. You can repossess a house. You can garnish a wage. You can seize a ship's cargo in a harbor. You cannot repossess a country. The most powerful financial markets on the planet were now holding billions in legal claims against a government that had simply announced those claims did not exist. And there was, quite literally, nothing they could do to enforce them. No court, no bailiff, no army that anyone was willing to send. And in Paris, in tens of thousands of quiet homes, the full meaning of all this was only just beginning to arrive. And this is the part of the story that ought to stay with you. Because the cost of this catastrophe did not land where you might expect it to land. The Tsar was already dead. The bankers who had floated the bonds had taken their handsome commissions years, even decades earlier. That money was long since collected and long since safe. The architects of the whole machine, the men who had built it and profited from it, were almost all beyond anyone's reach. The cost landed, instead, on the smallest and the most trusting people in the entire chain. The widow living on her interest payments, the retired clerk, the provincial shopkeeper, the farming family that had done nothing more reckless than exactly what the respectable newspapers and the respectable banks and the government itself had assured them was the safe, the sensible, and the patriotic thing to do. They had followed every rule, they had trusted every authority, and they were ruined for it, completely and permanently. And there was a final cruelty in how it ended, because the certificates did not even have the decency to disappear. They remained, beautiful, ornate, and utterly worthless, sitting in drawers across France for decade after decade. The French gave them a bitter name, papier russe, Russian papers, a phrase that came to mean a worthless thing dressed up as a treasure. Families held on to them, passing them from parent to child like an heirloom of grief, kept against the faint, stubborn hope that someday a French government or some future Russia would finally make it right. Some families eventually papered their actual walls with them. A bondholders association fought the case doggedly for generation after generation and got, for the most part, nowhere. And it was not for want of trying at the very highest level either. In 1922, the great powers of Europe gathered for an enormous conference at Genoa in Italy, and one of its central purposes was precisely this: to force the new Soviet state to make good on the debts the Tsar had run up. The creditor nations arrived expecting to confront a bankrupt outcast that would have to come to terms. The Soviets turned the entire table over. They came not as supplicants, but with demands of their own, insisting that before a single word was spoken about old debts, the West must first formally recognize their government and extend fresh loans. And they laid down a vast counterbill of their own for the devastation caused by the foreign armies that had invaded Russia during its civil war. The conference produced nothing on the debts whatsoever. Instead, the Soviet delegation quietly slipped away to a town nearby and signed a separate treaty with Germany, the other great outcast of Europe, and left the assembled creditors standing there with their grievances, their lawyers, and not one franc to show for any of it. There was, once again, simply no lever to pull. So here is the full reversal, the thing this whole story was built to reveal. Every other episode in this series is a story about the power of the lender, the City of London, the banks of Paris, the bondholder whose ledger owns the future. This is the one time the whip broke in the lender's hand. And underneath it sits the single lesson that the entire edifice of global finance is constructed, very deliberately, never to say out loud. A sovereign debt is not money. It is a promise. And a promise is worth precisely, exactly, what the one who made it is willing to honor, and not one franc more. The gold backing, the beautiful certificates, the respectable banks, the blessing of the state. None of it, in the end, was security at all. The only thing that had ever secured those bonds was Russia's willingness to pay them. And one winter morning, with a stroke of a pen, Russia simply withdrew it. As for how it was finally resolved, if you can even call it that, the scale tells you everything. It took until 1997, nearly 80 years. That was when a post-Soviet Russia at last agreed to settle the matter of the Tsarist bonds with France for a payment of around $400 million. A token, a rounding error against the immense fortune that had once been promised, handed at long last not to the people who had been ruined, most of whom were long dead, but to their grandchildren. And if you are tempted to file all of this away as dead history, a strange tragedy from a vanished world of czars and telegraph wires, then understand this. The discovery that Lenin's government made in 1918, the discovery that sovereign money is only ever as safe as politics will allow it to be, is being relearned right now in real time. And this time, the wheel has turned all the way around. Since 2022, the West has frozen roughly $300 billion of the Russian central bank's reserves, about half of everything Russia held abroad, most of it immobilized inside a single clearinghouse in Belgium. In December of 2025, the European Union voted to keep those funds frozen indefinitely, and the debate over whether to cross the final line and seize them outright has not stopped for a single day since. And Russia, cast now, for once, as the creditor whose money is being held hostage, is discovering precisely what those French bondholders discovered a century ago, that there is no recourse you can actually enforce. Moscow has sued the Belgian clearinghouse in its own courts, and in May of 2026, it won, in order to be paid back some $250 billion. A judgment that its own courts have no power whatsoever to collect beyond Russia's borders. The roles are reversed. The helplessness is identical. And every central bank on earth is watching this happen. Because the system that holds the savings of the entire world, the trillions in dollars and euros parked inside Western financial institutions, rests on the very same article of faith that the rente russe once rested on. The simple belief that the money will be there when you reach for it. That politics will not, one morning, decide to make it vanish. And once that faith begins to crack, history suggests the cracking does not stop. It is why so many governments are now quietly moving their reserves into gold, buying the metal at a pace the world has not seen in generations, and watching the dollar's long and unquestioned grip on global reserves slowly loosen year by year. For the first time in living memory, the people who hold the world's money are forced to ask whether the safest money in the world is safe at all. The men who sold the Tsar's bonds believed, to their bones, that they were trading in the most secure asset in all of Europe. The question the next 10 years are going to answer is whether the people holding today's reserve currencies are about to learn the very same lesson. Because in the end, a debt is only ever a promise. And in 1918, the world learned something it has been trying to forget ever since. That a promise, even one written in gold and signed by an empire, can be unwritten with a single stroke of a pen. And that the people who pay for it are almost never the ones who were warned.